A widow desperate for work, a hunter alone in the wilderness. When survival meets loneliness, they discover that the deepest wounds aren't made by bullets, but by the ghosts of those who left, and the courage it takes to let someone new in. The cabin door swung open before Margaret Hayes could knock a second time. She'd raised her hand, knuckles hovering over the weathered wood, when it jerked inward and a man filled the frame. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a beard that hadn't seen a razor in months and eyes that looked right through her like she was made of smoke. Margaret's breath caught. She'd rehearsed what to say during the 2-day walk from town, but standing here now with her daughter's hand clutched in hers, and the man's stare boring into her skull, every word scattered like startled birds. "I'm here about the work," she managed, voice steadier than she felt. "The posting in town said you needed help with cooking and keeping house." The man said nothing. His gaze dropped to Sarah, Margaret's daughter, who pressed herself against her mother's skirt and stared at the ground. 5 years old, and already she'd learned to make herself small, to disappear when adults spoke. Margaret's heart twisted. Sarah used to laugh, used to run through fields chasing butterflies and singing songs that made no sense. That was before the fever took Thomas, before everything crumbled. "That's my daughter, Sarah," Margaret added when the silence stretched too long. "She's quiet, won't be any trouble." Still nothing. The man's jaw worked like he was chewing words he couldn't spit out. Margaret's stomach dropped. She'd walked 2 days through rough country with blistered feet and an empty canteen because the posting had promised room and board plus a small wage. She'd left behind the boarding house where the landlady's patience had worn thinner than paper, and the pitying looks from neighbors who whispered about poor Margaret Hayes and her fatherless child. This job was supposed to be her fresh start, her lifeline. If he turned her away now? "Name's Jacob Thorne," the man said abruptly. "You cook?" "Yes, sir, my husband used to say," she stopped herself. Thomas was gone. What he used to say didn't matter anymore. "Yes, I can cook." Jacob stepped aside, gesturing them in with a rough sweep of his arm. Margaret didn't hesitate. She pulled Sarah across the threshold and into the cabin's dim interior, relief flooding through her so intensely her knees nearly buckled. They were inside. That was the first hurdle cleared. The cabin was larger than she'd expected, but somehow felt suffocating. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, cold and dark. A table sat near the window, its surface cluttered with tools, leather straps, and what looked like animal traps in various states of disrepair. The air smelled of old smoke, leather, and something else, something stale and neglected, like a place where hope had died quietly and nobody had bothered to bury it. Margaret's eyes swept the room, cataloging the unwashed dishes stacked haphazardly near a dry sink, the dust coating every surface, the rumpled blankets on a bed shoved into the corner. This wasn't just a bachelor's mess. This was abandonment. Jacob closed the door and moved past them without a word, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. He crossed to the fireplace and knelt, striking flint to tinder with practiced efficiency. Sparks caught. Small flames licked upward, casting flickering light that made the shadows dance. Margaret watched his hands, steady, capable, but scarred in ways that spoke of years lived rough. When he straightened and turned back to face her, she saw something in his expression that made her chest tighten. Not cruelty. Not even coldness. Just emptiness, like a well that had run dry. "You'll sleep there," Jacob said, nodding toward a small door Margaret hadn't noticed. "It's a separate room. Used to be," he cut himself off, jaw clenching. "It's yours now, you and the girl." "Thank you," Margaret said softly. Sarah's grip on her hand tightened. Jacob's gaze flicked to Sarah again, lingering this time. Something shifted in his face, a crack in that stony exterior, barely visible but there. Then it was gone, smoothed over like wind erasing tracks in sand. "You eat yet?" Margaret shook her head. They'd finished the last of their bread that morning, and her stomach had been gnawing at itself for hours. Sarah must be starving, though she hadn't complained once. Good girl, too good. Jacob moved to a shelf and pulled down a cloth-wrapped bundle. He set it on the table and unwrapped it, revealing dried meat and a half-loaf of dark bread. Not much, but it'll hold you till morning. Tomorrow you start earning your keep. He paused, then added almost reluctantly, "There's a well out back. Water's clean." Margaret nodded, throat tight with gratitude she didn't know how to express. She guided Sarah to the table and tore off pieces of bread, handing one to her daughter and taking a small piece for herself. The meat was tough and salty, but it was food, and right now that meant everything. Sarah chewed slowly, eyes darting around the cabin like a nervous animal checking for predators. Jacob didn't sit. He stood near the fireplace, arms crossed, watching them eat with an expression Margaret couldn't read. The silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of flames and the soft sounds of chewing. Margaret wanted to say something, thank him properly, ask questions about the work, break this uncomfortable quiet, but instinct told her to wait. This man wasn't used to conversation. Pushing too hard too fast would only drive him further behind whatever walls he'd built. When they finished eating, Jacob gestured toward the small door. "Get some rest. Dawn comes early." Margaret rose, gathering Sarah into her arms even though the girl was getting too big to carry. She crossed to the door and pushed it open, revealing a tiny room with a narrow bed, a single window and nothing else. It was sparse, almost prison-like, but it was theirs. A door that closed, a roof that didn't leak, a space where they could breathe without someone watching, judging, waiting for them to fail. She set Sarah on the bed and smoothed the girl's tangled hair. "We're safe now," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was trying to convince Sarah or herself. Sarah nodded but said nothing, curling onto her side and tucking her knees to her chest. Within minutes her breathing had evened out into sleep. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the muffled sounds of Jacob moving around the main room, the scrape of a chair, the clink of metal on wood, the heavy tread of boots. She should sleep. Tomorrow would bring work, and she needed to prove herself capable, needed to show Jacob Thorne that hiring her wasn't a mistake. But sleep felt impossible. Her mind raced, replaying the past months in painful detail. Thomas's death, the bills piling up, the landlady's tight-lipped ultimatums, the slow, grinding realization that she was alone in a world that had no patience for poor widows with children to feed. She'd come here because she had no other choice, but now, sitting in this strange man's home, she wondered what she'd walked into. Through the crack beneath the door she saw the flicker of firelight, heard Jacob's footsteps stop, then start again. He was pacing. Margaret closed her eyes and let exhaustion pull her under, but even in sleep, she felt the weight of this place pressing down on her like stones. Morning arrived with pale light filtering through the small window. Margaret woke with a start, disoriented, until she remembered where she was. Sarah still slept beside her, one small hand tucked beneath her cheek. Margaret rose carefully, smoothing her dress and trying to tame her hair with her fingers. She had no mirror, no brush, no way to make herself presentable, but it would have to do. She opened the door and stepped into the main room. Jacob was already up, standing near the window with a cup of something steaming in his hand. He glanced at her, nodded once, then turned his attention back to whatever he was watching outside. "There's coffee," he said without looking at her. "Pot's on the stove." Margaret crossed to the stove, a cast-iron beast that looked older than the cabin itself. She found a chipped mug and poured herself coffee, thick, bitter, and scalding hot. It burned her throat going down, but she welcomed the pain. It meant she was alive. It meant she'd made it through another night. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, keeping her voice low so as not to wake Sarah. Jacob set his cup down and finally turned to face her. In the morning light she could see him more clearly. He wasn't old, maybe mid-30s, but he carried himself like a man twice that age. His face was weathered, lined with sun and hardship, and his eyes held the kind of weariness that came from years of fighting battles nobody won. "House needs cleaning," he said. "Cooking, mending, the usual." Margaret nodded. "I can do that." "Good," he hesitated, then added, "My wife used to handle all that. She's been gone near a year now." The words landed heavy between them. Margaret didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. She just held her coffee and waited. Jacob's jaw tightened. She didn't die, she left, packed her things one morning and walked out. Said she couldn't stand the isolation anymore, couldn't stand me. He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. Can't say I blame her. Margaret's heart clenched. She understood loneliness, understood the ache of being left behind. I'm sorry, she said quietly. Jacob shrugged, but the gesture was stiff, forced. Don't need your pity, just need the work done. You'll have it, Margaret promised. He studied her for a long moment, and she had the unsettling feeling he was seeing past her words, past her careful composure, right down to the desperation she was trying so hard to hide. Then he nodded, grabbed his hat from a peg near the door, and stepped outside without another word. Margaret stood alone in the cabin, steam rising from her coffee, and wondered what kind of man Jacob Thorne really was beneath all that silence and stone. Margaret spent the first hour simply staring at the mess, trying to decide where to begin. The cabin wasn't large, but the neglect had accumulated like layers of sediment, each one marking another day Jacob Thorne had stopped caring. Dishes were crusted with food so old it had hardened into something resembling clay. The floor was tracked with mud and debris that had been ground into the wood grain. Cobwebs hung in corners thick as lace curtains, and the windows were so filmed with grime that the morning light came through gray and muted. Sarah emerged from the small room, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She looked around with wide, uncertain eyes, and Margaret felt a pang of guilt so sharp it nearly stole her breath. This was no place for a child, but it was the only place they had. Come here, sweet girl, Margaret said softly, kneeling down. Sarah crossed to her and buried her face in Margaret's shoulder. I need you to be brave today. Can you do that for me? Sarah nodded against her neck. Good, I'm going to clean and I need you to stay out of the way. Maybe you can sit by the window and watch for birds. Would you like that? Another nod. Sarah pulled back and went to the window, pressing her face against the dirty glass. Margaret watched her for a moment, chest tight with love and fear and a desperate hope that this gamble would somehow work out. Then she rolled up her sleeves and got to work. She started with the dishes, heating water on the stove and scrubbing until her hands were red and raw. The work was meditative in its way, the repetitive motions giving her mind something to focus on besides worry. As she worked, she let herself think about Jacob. He'd mentioned his wife left because of isolation, because she couldn't stand him. Margaret wondered what that meant. Was he cruel? Violent? He hadn't seemed either of those things, but then again, people wore masks. Thomas had seemed gentle once too, before the drinking started, before his temper became something she had to navigate like walking on river ice. But Jacob didn't smell of whiskey. His hands weren't marked by the telltale tremor of a habitual drinker, and the way he'd looked at Sarah, there'd been something almost tender in that glance, quickly buried but there nonetheless. Margaret decided to reserve judgment. She'd learned the hard way that snap decisions could be as dangerous as no decisions at all. By midday the dishes were clean and stacked neatly on the shelf. Margaret had moved on to sweeping, attacking the floor with a broom she found leaning in a corner. Dust rose in clouds, making her cough, but she kept at it, working methodically from one end of the cabin to the other. Sarah had fallen asleep curled up beneath the window, exhausted from their journey and the morning's tension. Margaret let her sleep. The door opened without warning. Jacob stepped inside, pausing when he saw the transformation. His eyes swept the room, the clean dishes, the swept floor, the cleared table, and something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or something deeper, more painful. You've been busy, he said, voice rough. It needed doing, Margaret replied, leaning the broom against the wall. She wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. Jacob's gaze moved to Sarah, still sleeping by the window. His expression softened almost imperceptibly. She always that quiet? Since her father died, yes. Margaret kept her voice steady, though talking about Thomas still felt like pressing on a bruise. She used to talk more, laugh more. The fever took that from her along with him. Jacob was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Fever's cruel that way, takes more than just bodies." Margaret met his eyes and saw recognition there. He understood loss. Maybe not the same kind she'd endured, but loss nonetheless. It created a fragile thread of connection between them, thin as spider silk but present. "I brought meat," Jacob said, shifting the conversation. He held up 2 rabbits, freshly killed and already cleaned. "Figured you could make stew." "I can," Margaret said. She took the rabbits from him, their weight familiar in her hands. She prepared countless meals with Thomas, back when they'd had a home, back when life had felt stable. "Thank you." Jacob nodded and moved to the table, sitting down heavily. He looked tired, Margaret realized. Not just physically exhausted, but worn down by something internal, something that ground at him constantly. She wondered when he'd last had a decent meal, a clean home, someone to talk to beyond whatever conversations he had with himself in the wilderness. She set to work on the stew, chopping vegetables from a small store she'd found in a crate near the stove. As she worked, she felt Jacob watching her, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but with a kind of desperate hunger that had nothing to do with food. He was watching domesticity return to his home, watching the ghost of what he'd lost take shape in front of him. Margaret understood that too. Sometimes the hardest part of losing someone wasn't their absence. It was the absence of all the small, ordinary things they used to do. "Your wife," Margaret said carefully, keeping her hands busy with the knife. "How long were you married?" Jacob was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, 5 years, met her in town. She was working at the hotel serving tables, pretty thing. Laughed easy. He paused. "Too easy, maybe. Made me think I could be something other than what I am." "What are you?" Margaret asked, surprising herself with her boldness. Jacob's laugh was bitter. "A man better suited to solitude than company, a hunter who spends more time with the dead than the living. She figured that out eventually. Figured out I wasn't going to change, wasn't going to move back to town, wasn't going to be the husband she'd imagined." He leaned back in his chair, eyes distant. "Can't fault her for leaving. She gave it an honest try." Margaret stirred the pot, watching steam rise. Loneliness can break people in different ways. Some can't stand being alone. Others can't stand being with someone who makes them feel alone anyway. Jacob's eyes snapped to her, sharp and searching. "You speaking from experience?" Margaret hesitated, then decided honesty might be the only currency worth anything here. "My husband drank. Toward the end, I'd sit across from him at dinner and feel like I was dining with a stranger. He was there in body but gone in every way that mattered. When the fever took him, I grieved, but part of me had been grieving long before he died." The words hung in the air between them, raw and true. Jacob nodded slowly, understanding passing wordlessly between them. They were both haunted by absences, hers by death, his by choice, but the ache was similar enough to recognize. Sarah stirred by the window, waking with a small whimper. Margaret set down the spoon and went to her, kneeling beside her daughter and brushing hair from her face. "You're all right, sweet girl, just a dream." Sarah's eyes focused on Margaret, then drifted to Jacob. The girl tensed, pressing closer to her mother. Jacob noticed, and something in his expression crumbled, just for a moment, before he rebuilt the walls. "She afraid of me?" he asked quietly. "She's afraid of everything right now," Margaret said gently. "It's not personal." But she could see it hurt him anyway, could see how her daughter's fear landed like a physical blow. Jacob stood abruptly, chair scraping against the floor. "I'll be outside. Call me when the food's ready." He left before Margaret could respond, the door closing firmly behind him. She held Sarah close and listened to his boots retreat across the porch, wondering how long a man could live with rejection before he stopped hoping for anything different. The stew simmered as afternoon bled into evening. Margaret cleaned more, finding rhythm in the work, while Sarah slowly began to explore the cabin with cautious steps. The girl found a carved wooden horse tucked on a high shelf and held it up to Margaret with questioning eyes. "I think that belonged to someone who used to live here," Margaret said softly. "Maybe Mr. Thorne's wife had a child, or planned to." The thought made her sad in ways she couldn't quite name. When the stew was ready, Margaret stepped outside to call Jacob. She found him sitting on the porch steps, whittling a piece of wood with a small knife. Shavings curled at his feet like pale ribbons. He looked up when she approached, and in the fading light his face seemed softer, younger somehow. "Food's ready," she said. Jacob nodded and stood, brushing wood shavings from his pants. He followed her inside, and they ate together in near silence. Sarah sat close to Margaret, eating slowly, stealing glances at Jacob when she thought he wasn't looking. Jacob pretended not to notice, but Margaret saw how carefully he moved, how deliberately he kept his voice low and his gestures small, as if trying to make himself less intimidating. After dinner, Jacob retreated to the porch again while Margaret cleaned up and put Sarah to bed. The girl fought sleep, anxious in the unfamiliar place, but eventually exhaustion won. Margaret tucked the thin blanket around her daughter's small form and pressed a kiss to her forehead. When she emerged from the small room, she found Jacob still outside. She should go to bed herself. Tomorrow would bring more work, but something drew her to the door. She stepped out onto the porch, wrapping her arms around herself against the evening chill. Jacob glanced at her but said nothing. They stood in silence, watching stars emerge one by one against the darkening sky. Out here, far from any town, the stars seemed impossibly bright, like holes punched through black fabric to reveal light beyond. "It's beautiful," Margaret said quietly. "It is," Jacob agreed. "Sometimes I think it's the only beautiful thing left in the world." Margaret heard the loneliness in those words, the resignation. She understood it, had felt it herself on countless nights after Thomas died when the world seemed scrubbed of color and joy. But she'd had Sarah. Sarah had been her reason to keep going, to keep fighting. What did Jacob have? "Thank you," she said, "for taking us in. I know we're strangers. I know this wasn't what you expected when you posted that notice." Jacob was quiet for a long moment. Then, "You needed help, I needed help," seemed practical enough. But it wasn't just practical, Margaret thought. She'd seen the way he looked at the clean cabin, at Sarah, at the simple domesticity of a shared meal. He needed more than cleaning and cooking. He needed proof that life could be more than just survival, more than waiting for the next day to pass. She couldn't fix him. She was barely holding herself together, but maybe they could help each other stay afloat. Maybe that was enough. "Good night, Jacob," she said softly. "Good night, Margaret." She went inside, closed the door and leaned against it, listening to the night sounds filtering through the walls. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight they were safe, fed, and sheltered. For now, that was more than enough. The days began to blur together in a rhythm Margaret hadn't expected to find comforting. She rose before dawn, stoked the fire, prepared coffee, and whatever breakfast she could manage from Jacob's sparse stores. He'd leave shortly after eating, disappearing into the woods with his rifle and traps, returning hours later with game or empty-handed, but always quiet, always withdrawn. Margaret would spend the day cleaning, mending, cooking, trying to create order from the chaos Jacob had been living in. Sarah remained her shadow, following her from task to task, speaking only in whispers when she spoke at all. By the end of the first week, the cabin had transformed. Margaret had scrubbed every surface, mended curtains she'd found stuffed in a trunk, organized the shelves, and even planted a small herb garden near the door using seeds she'd discovered in a forgotten jar. The place still felt sparse and masculine, but it no longer felt abandoned. It felt lived in again, cared for. Jacob noticed. He didn't say much, but Margaret caught him sometimes standing in the doorway, looking around with an expression that wavered between gratitude and grief. She understood. Every improvement reminded him of what he'd lost, of the life his wife had tried to build here before giving up. But Margaret couldn't stop. This was her job, her purpose, the only thing standing between her and Sarah and destitution. So she kept working, kept transforming, and tried not to think too hard about the weight of Jacob's silence. It was Sarah who broke through first. Margaret was kneading bread dough one afternoon when she heard it, a sound so unexpected she nearly dropped the dough. Laughter. Sarah's laughter, high and bright, coming from outside. Margaret's heart lurched. She wiped flour from her hands and rushed to the door. Sarah was in the yard, chasing a butterfly that danced just out of reach. And Jacob was there too, sitting on a stump watching her with something that might have been a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. When he saw Margaret, the almost smile vanished, replaced by his usual guarded expression. She asked if she could go outside, Jacob said, as if defending himself. Seemed safe enough. It's fine, Margaret said quickly. I'm glad. She needs to play, needs to remember how. She paused, then added softly, thank you for watching her. Jacob shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude. Wasn't doing anything else. But Margaret could see it cost him something to let down his guard even that much, to allow himself to care about the small girl who'd invaded his carefully constructed solitude. She went back inside, but through the window she watched them, Sarah playing, Jacob pretending not to watch, and something in her chest loosened just slightly. That night after Sarah had gone to bed, Margaret found Jacob on the porch again. It had become his refuge, that porch, the place where he could escape the domesticity inside while not quite leaving entirely. She'd learned not to take it personally. Some people needed distance to breathe. She smiled today, Jacob said without preamble when Margaret stepped outside. Your daughter, first time I've seen it. First time in months, Margaret admitted, settling onto the porch steps. She used to smile all the time. After Thomas died, it was like she forgot how. Jacob was quiet, whittling again. The knife moved in steady, practiced strokes, peeling away slivers of wood. What happened to him? Your husband, if you don't mind my asking. Margaret drew her knees up, wrapping her arms around them. Fever. Same one that killed half the town that winter. He lasted longer than most, 10 days of burning up, then chills, then burning again. Sarah watched him waste away. Watched me try everything I knew and fail. She hasn't been the same since. Children shouldn't have to see that, Jacob said quietly. No, they shouldn't. Margaret looked up at the stars, fighting the tightness in her throat. But life doesn't much care what children should or shouldn't see, does it? Jacob made a sound that might have been agreement. They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the scrape of his knife and the distant call of a night bird. Then Jacob spoke again, his voice rougher than usual. I wanted children. Catherine, my wife, she did too at first. We tried for 3 years. Nothing took. After a while she stopped wanting to try, said it was probably for the best, bringing a child into this kind of life. Margaret heard the pain beneath the words, the failure he'd internalized. It's not your fault, she said gently. These things just happen sometimes. Maybe, Jacob set down his knife and the half-carved piece of wood. Or maybe she was right. Maybe I'm not meant for that kind of life, the family kind. You were kind to Sarah today, Margaret pointed out. You made her laugh. That takes a gentle heart. Jacob's jaw tightened. Don't mistake tolerance for gentleness. I just didn't want the girl scared all the time. But Margaret had seen it, that flicker of something soft in his eyes when Sarah laughed, the careful way he'd kept his distance so as not to frighten her but stayed close enough to keep her safe. Jacob Thorne could deny it all he wanted, but there was warmth in him still, buried deep but not extinguished. His wife had left, but she hadn't managed to kill that part of him entirely. Well, Margaret said, rising and brushing off her skirt, whether you call it tolerance or kindness, it helped her. So thank you. She went inside before he could argue, but she felt his eyes on her back, felt the weight of words he wasn't ready to speak. The second week brought rain. Not the violent storms Margaret remembered from her childhood, but steady, relentless rain that turned the world gray and trapped them all inside. Jacob grew restless, pacing the cabin like a caged animal. Margaret tried to stay out of his way, keeping Sarah quiet and occupied with small tasks, sorting buttons, folding cloth scraps, anything to keep her busy. But the cabin was small, and there was only so much distance they could maintain. By the third day of rain, the tension had stretched thin and brittle. Jacob snapped at Margaret over something trivial. She'd moved his tools to clean the table and hadn't put them back exactly right. Margaret snapped back, her own patience frayed. Sarah started crying, overwhelmed by the raised voices, and both adults immediately stopped, shamefaced and silent. Jacob left then, despite the rain, disappearing into the gray curtain of water without a coat or hat. Margaret held Sarah until the girl's tears subsided, whispering apologies and reassurances. But inside, Margaret's own emotions churned. She'd been here 2 weeks and already the cracks were showing. How long could they maintain this arrangement? How long before Jacob decided they were more trouble than they were worth? He returned hours later, soaked to the bone and shivering. Margaret had hot coffee waiting and a blanket warming by the fire. She handed them to him without a word. Jacob took them, also silent, and sat near the hearth staring into the flames. "I'm sorry," he said finally, voice rough, "for earlier, you didn't deserve that." "Neither did you," Margaret replied. "I should have asked before moving your things." Jacob shook his head. "It's your space too now. You and Sarah, you should be able to move things." He paused, struggling with something. "I'm not used to sharing, not used to considering anyone else. Catherine tried to teach me, but I was stubborn, too stubborn." Margaret sat down across from him, keeping the fire between them. "We're all learning here. You're learning to share space. I'm learning to ask for what I need instead of just surviving. Sarah's learning to trust again. None of it's easy." Jacob looked at her then, really looked at her, and Margaret felt exposed under that gaze. She'd spent so long hiding her fear, her exhaustion, her desperate hope that this arrangement would work. But Jacob saw through it all. Saw her the way she saw him, stripped of pretense, raw and real. "You're stronger than you look," he said quietly. "I have to be," Margaret replied. "For her." She glanced toward the small room where Sarah was playing with the carved horse. "She's all I have left." Something shifted in Jacob's expression. "She's lucky to have you." The words were simple, but they landed with unexpected weight. Margaret felt her eyes sting with sudden tears. When was the last time someone had told her she was doing a good job, that her efforts mattered? Thomas had stopped noticing her long before he died. The town had pitied her but never praised her. Here in this isolated cabin with a broken man and his ghosts, she'd finally heard the words she'd been desperate to hear. "Thank you," she whispered. Jacob nodded and turned back to the fire, but something had changed between them. The walls were still there, but they'd shifted, cracked, let in a little light. The rain stopped the next morning. Jacob left early and Margaret threw open the windows to air out the cabin. Sarah ventured outside immediately, splashing in puddles and laughing at the way mud squelched between her toes. Margaret watched from the doorway, smiling despite herself. This was what she'd wanted, Sarah being a child again, finding joy in simple things. Jacob returned midday with a deer. Margaret heard him before she saw him, the heavy drag of the carcass through the wet grass. She stepped outside to find him tying the deer to a beam near the side of the cabin, preparing to dress it. Blood darkened his hands and stained his shirt. "That'll feed us for weeks," Margaret said, impressed despite herself. "That's the idea," Jacob replied, not looking at her. His hands worked efficiently, the knife moving with practiced precision. Margaret had seen Thomas dress game before, but there was something different about watching Jacob. Thomas had been competent but careless, often wasting meat. Jacob wasted nothing. Every cut was deliberate, respectful even, as if honoring the animal's sacrifice. "Can I help?" Margaret asked. Jacob glanced at her, surprised. "It's messy work. I've dressed game before, and you'll finish faster with 2 pairs of hands." Jacob hesitated, then nodded. "Wash your hands first. Use the strong soap." Margaret did as instructed, then joined him at the carcass. They worked in synchronized silence, Jacob directing her occasionally but mostly just letting her work. His hands brushed hers once when reaching for the same tool, and Margaret felt a jolt go through her, not attraction exactly, but recognition. They were two people trying to survive, to build something from the wreckage of their previous lives. There was intimacy in that, whether either of them was ready for it or not. When they finished, the sun was lowering toward the horizon. Margaret's arms ached and her dress was ruined, but she felt accomplished. Useful. Jacob carried the meat inside while Margaret cleaned up outside, scrubbing blood from her hands and forearms. When she came in, she found Jacob had already started preparing some of the meat for dinner. "You cook too?" she asked, surprised. "Had to learn when Catherine left," Jacob said with a shrug. "Wasn't good at it, but I managed." They cooked together that evening, moving around each other in the small space with an ease that hadn't existed before. Sarah set the table without being asked, arranging utensils with careful precision. When they sat down to eat, it felt almost like a family dinner, awkward and tentative but real. "This is good," Sarah said suddenly, her voice small but clear. Both adults froze. It was the first time Sarah had spoken directly to Jacob, the first words she'd volunteered in his presence. Margaret's heart hammered in her chest, afraid to break the moment. Jacob cleared his throat. "Thank you, Sarah. Your mother did most of the work." Sarah nodded solemnly, then went back to eating. But something had shifted. The girl had acknowledged him, included him in their small circle. Margaret saw what it meant to Jacob, saw the way his shoulders relaxed slightly, the way his grip on his fork loosened. He'd been accepted, however tentatively, and it mattered more than he'd ever admit. After dinner, as Margaret cleaned up, she heard voices outside. Jacob and Sarah talking quietly on the porch. She moved to the window and saw them sitting on the steps together, Jacob showing Sarah the piece of wood he'd been carving. It was a bird, she realized, delicate and detailed. Sarah held it carefully, turning it over in her small hands. Margaret pressed a hand to her chest, overwhelmed by the simple beauty of the moment. Her daughter was healing, and maybe, just maybe, so was Jacob Thorne. 3 weeks in, and Margaret woke to find frost painting the windows in delicate patterns. Winter was creeping closer, and with it came a kind of reckoning she hadn't anticipated. Supplies were running low. The flour tin was nearly empty, the coffee almost gone, and the small store of dried goods Jacob had accumulated wouldn't last through the cold months ahead. They needed to go to town. Jacob announced it over breakfast, his voice flat and final. "We'll need to make a supply run soon, before the first real snow." Margaret's stomach tightened. Town meant people, questions, judgment. It meant facing the life she'd fled and the gossip that had followed her like a shadow. But there was no avoiding it. They needed supplies, and she had no money of her own to contribute. She was dependent on Jacob for everything, and that dependence sat heavy in her chest like a stone. "When?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. 2 days from now. Give me time to set the traps first, make sure nothing's wasted while we're gone." Jacob glanced at Sarah, who was pushing eggs around her plate. "The girl will need warmer clothes. What she's wearing won't hold against real cold." Margaret nodded, throat tight. Sarah's coat was threadbare, her shoes nearly worn through. Margaret had patched them twice already, but patches could only do so much. "I know, I don't have the money to." "I'll cover it," Jacob interrupted. "Consider it part of your wages." Wages? The word felt strange. Jacob hadn't paid her anything yet, hadn't even mentioned it since that first day. Margaret had assumed he'd forgotten or decided room and board was payment enough. But now, hearing him acknowledge the debt, something in her chest loosened slightly. "Thank you," she said quietly. Jacob just nodded and went back to his breakfast. The subject closed as far as he was concerned. But Margaret saw Sarah watching him with those solemn eyes, saw the way her daughter's expression had changed over the past weeks. The fear was still there, but it was fading, replaced by something that might become trust if given enough time. The day before the trip, Jacob disappeared into the woods and returned with 2 rabbits and a string of fish. Margaret prepared them for preservation, salting and smoking the meat, while Jacob repaired the wagon and checked the horses' shoes. They moved around each other with the practiced ease of people who'd learned each other's rhythms, anticipating needs without speaking. It should have felt natural. Instead, it felt dangerous, like standing on the edge of something Margaret couldn't quite name. That evening, after Sarah had gone to bed, Margaret found Jacob in the barn tending to the horses. She stood in the doorway watching him work, brush moving in long strokes across the mare's flank. The lamplight cast shadows that made his face look carved from stone, all hard angles and sharp edges. But his hands were gentle, and the horse leaned into his touch, trusting. "I need to ask you something," Margaret said, her voice cutting through the quiet. Jacob glanced over his shoulder but didn't stop brushing. "Ask." "In town, if people question why I'm with you, what do I tell them?" Jacob's hand stilled. He set down the brush and turned to face her fully. "Tell them the truth. You're my housekeeper, that's all." "They'll talk anyway," Margaret said. "A widow living alone with a man. Even with Sarah there, they'll make assumptions." "Let them." Jacob's voice was hard, but Margaret heard the defensiveness beneath it. "People talked about Catherine and me too. Talked about how she left, about what I must have done to drive her away. Talking's all some people know how to do. Doesn't make it worth listening to." Margaret stepped further into the barn, closer but still keeping distance. "I just want to be prepared, for Sarah's sake, if people say cruel things." "They won't say them to your face," Jacob interrupted. "Not if I'm standing there." He paused, then added more quietly, "I won't let anyone hurt her, or you." The promise landed heavy between them. Margaret believed him, which surprised her. She'd learned not to trust men's promises, had watched Thomas break every vow he'd ever made. But Jacob was different. His promises came reluctantly, dragged out of him like confessions, and that made them feel more real somehow. "All right," Margaret said softly, "thank you." Jacob picked up the brush again, returning to his work. "Get some sleep. We'll leave early." Margaret left him there in the lamplight with the horses and his solitude. But as she walked back to the cabin, she felt the weight of tomorrow pressing down on her. Town would test them in ways this isolated cabin never could. It would expose the fragility of what they were building here, whatever that was. Morning came cold and sharp. Margaret dressed Sarah in layers, bundling her until the girl looked like a small bear. Jacob loaded the wagon with furs he'd trapped and cleaned, goods he could trade for supplies. The ride to town took 3 hours, the wagon creaking along rutted roads through forests ablaze with autumn color. Sarah sat between them, quiet and watchful, her hand occasionally reaching for Margaret's when the wagon hit a particularly rough patch. Jacob didn't speak much during the journey, his attention on the road and the horses. But Margaret caught him glancing at Sarah more than once, checking to make sure she was secure, warm enough, not frightened by the unfamiliar journey. Each glance made Margaret's chest tighten with something she wasn't ready to examine too closely. Town appeared gradually, first scattered homesteads, then closer buildings, finally the main street with its general store, hotel, saloon, and handful of other establishments. Margaret's stomach churned as Jacob pulled the wagon to a stop outside the general store. She recognized the building, had been here before with Thomas. The memory felt like another lifetime. "Stay close," Jacob said, helping Sarah down from the wagon. His hand settled briefly on Margaret's elbow as she climbed down, steadying her. The touch was impersonal, practical, but Margaret felt it burn through her sleeve anyway. Inside the store, the warmth hit them immediately. The proprietor, a heavy-set man named Bill Carson, looked up from behind the counter, and his eyebrows climbed his forehead when he saw Jacob. "Well, I'll be damned. Jacob Thorne, thought you'd turned into a complete hermit." Bill's gaze shifted to Margaret and Sarah, curiosity sharp in his eyes. "And who might these ladies be?" "Margaret Hayes," Jacob said before Margaret could respond. "My housekeeper, and her daughter Sarah." Bill's expression shifted, understanding and speculation warring across his face. Housekeeper, eh? Good for you, Jacob. Place probably needed a woman's touch. His tone was jovial, but Margaret heard the undercurrent of judgment, the assumptions already forming. Just here for supplies, Jacob said, his voice cooling. Got a list. He pulled a folded paper from his pocket and handed it across. Bill took it, but his attention kept drifting back to Margaret and Sarah. Margaret lifted her chin, refusing to show the discomfort crawling up her spine. She'd faced worse than curious stares and small-town gossip. I'll get this together, Bill said. Might take a bit. You folks want to look around. Jacob nodded. He guided Margaret toward the back of the store where clothing hung from pegs and sat folded on shelves. His hand on her back was light but deliberate, a claim he probably didn't realize he was making. Margaret should have moved away, should have established distance. She didn't. Pick out what Sarah needs, Jacob said quietly, and something for yourself. That dress is worn through at the elbows. Margaret's face flushed. I can't. You can and you will. You work hard. You deserve to be warm. Jacob's tone left no room for argument. He crouched down to Sarah's level, his movements careful and slow. What's your favorite color, Sarah? Sarah blinked, surprised to be addressed directly. She glanced at Margaret, who nodded encouragement. Blue, Sarah whispered. Jacob smiled, a real smile, small but genuine. Let's find you something blue then. They spent the next hour selecting clothes. Jacob insisted on a heavy coat for Sarah, warm boots, gloves, and a scarf. For Margaret, he chose a sturdy wool dress in deep green and a shawl that would actually keep out the cold. Margaret tried to protest the expense, but Jacob silenced her with a look. I'm not destitute, he said quietly. The furs sell well and I don't spend much. Let me do this. Margaret relented, but emotion clogged her throat. When was the last time someone had cared about her comfort, her needs? Thomas had stopped noticing her long before he died, and since his passing she'd been invisible to everyone except as an object of pity. Jacob saw her, saw Sarah, made them real again. They were loading the wagon when the trouble started. A woman Margaret vaguely recognized, Mrs. Thornton, the minister's wife, approached with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Margaret Hayes, Mrs. Thornton said, her voice dripping false sweetness. I'd heard you'd left town, didn't realize you'd found employment so quickly. The pause before employment was deliberate, loaded with insinuation. Margaret's spine stiffened. Mr. Thorne needed a housekeeper. I needed work. It's a practical arrangement. I'm sure it is. Mrs. Thornton's gaze flickered to Jacob, who'd gone very still beside the wagon. Though I must say it's unusual for a widow to take a position in a bachelor's home, so isolated, just the two of you. Well, 3 counting the child. Her smile sharpened. People do talk. Then people need better things to occupy their time, Jacob said, his voice cold enough to frost glass. He stepped closer to Margaret, positioning himself slightly in front of her. Mrs. Hayes is a respectable woman doing honest work. Anyone who suggests otherwise will answer to me. Mrs. Thornton's smile faltered. I didn't mean to offend. Yes, you did. Jacob's stare could have cut steel. We're done here. He helped Margaret and Sarah into the wagon with deliberate care, then climbed up himself. They left Mrs. Thornton standing in the street, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Margaret felt a wild urge to laugh, but it died when she saw Jacob's hands gripping the reins so tight his knuckles had gone white. They were a mile outside town when Jacob finally spoke. I'm sorry for what she said, for what they'll all say. It's not your fault, Margaret replied softly. Sarah had fallen asleep against her side, exhausted by the day's stimulation. Isn't it? Jacob's jaw clenched. I brought you into this, gave them ammunition. You gave me and Sarah a home when we had none. Let them say what they want. I know the truth, so do you. Jacob glanced at her, something unreadable in his expression. The truth is complicated. "The truth," Margaret said carefully, "is that you're a good man trying to live quietly, and I'm a widow trying to provide for her daughter. Everything else is just noise." But even as she said it, Margaret wondered if she was convincing Jacob or herself, because the truth was more complicated than she wanted to admit. The truth was that she'd started looking forward to their quiet evenings on the porch, to the way Jacob's expression softened when Sarah laughed, to the comfortable silence that had replaced the awkward tension of those first days. The truth was that this arrangement, this practical solution to mutual needs, was starting to feel like something else entirely. And that terrified her. They reached the cabin as sunset painted the sky in shades of amber and rose. Jacob helped Sarah down, the girl still drowsy and pliant. Margaret watched him carry her inside, his large hands gentle as he laid her on the bed and tucked a blanket around her small form. When he straightened and turned, he found Margaret watching from the doorway. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for today, for defending me, for all of it." Jacob's throat worked, words clearly struggling to surface. Finally, he just nodded and moved past her, back outside to unload the wagon. But Margaret had seen it, that flash of something raw and vulnerable in his eyes, quickly hidden but there nonetheless. She stood in the doorway of the small room, watching her daughter sleep and listening to Jacob move around outside, and wondered what she'd gotten herself into. Wondered if saving herself and Sarah from destitution meant risking something far more dangerous than poverty. It meant risking her heart. The first snow came 3 days after their trip to town, falling soft and silent in the night. Margaret woke to a world transformed, everything blanketed in white that glowed pale blue in the pre-dawn light. She rose quietly, careful not to wake Sarah, and stepped into the main room to find Jacob already awake, standing at the window with a cup of coffee steaming in his hands. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said softly, moving to stand beside him. Jacob didn't respond immediately, his eyes fixed on the white expanse beyond the glass. "Beautiful and deadly. Snow like this can trap you for weeks if you're not prepared." Margaret heard the weight behind his words, the memory of last winter when Catherine had still been here, when the isolation had become too much to bear, and the snow had made escape impossible until spring. She understood then what he wasn't saying. That winter had been when his marriage finally died, when Catherine had realized she couldn't endure another season buried alive in this cabin with a man who couldn't give her what she needed. "We're prepared this time," Margaret said, trying to inject certainty into her voice. "The stores are full, the wood is stacked, we'll be fine." Jacob's jaw tightened. "You don't know what it's like, weeks without seeing another soul, the silence pressing in until you can't think straight. Catherine lasted 3 winters before she broke. How long will you last?" The question hit Margaret like a physical blow. She turned to face him fully, searching his profile for the fear she heard beneath the harshness. "I'm not Catherine." "No," Jacob agreed, finally looking at her. "You're not, but you're still human, still need more than just survival." Margaret wanted to argue, wanted to insist she could handle anything as long as Sarah was safe. But honesty stopped her. She didn't know what the winter would bring, how the isolation would wear on her, whether the quiet that seemed peaceful now would eventually feel suffocating. All she knew was that going back to town, back to judgment and pity and the slow starvation of body and spirit, wasn't an option. "Then we'll figure it out together," she said finally. "All 3 of us. We'll make it work because we have to." Something flickered in Jacob's eyes, hope, maybe, or the ghost of it. He nodded once, then turned back to the window, but his shoulder was touching hers now, a point of warmth and contact that neither of them acknowledged or moved away from. The snow continued through the morning, piling up in drifts that reached halfway up the porch steps. Sarah woke and pressed her face to the window with wonder, her breath fogging the glass. She'd never seen snow this deep, this pristine. Margaret found her old boots and helped her bundle up, then watched from the doorway as Sarah ventured out into the white world, taking tentative steps that left small prints behind her. Jacob appeared beside Margaret, watching Sarah with that expression he got sometimes, soft and aching, like looking at something he'd lost or never had. "She should have a sled," he said suddenly. "A sled. For the hill behind the cabin. It's perfect for sliding when the snow packs down." Jacob's voice carried a distance, as if he was seeing something beyond the present moment. "Catherine and I used to talk about having children, about watching them play in the snow. I thought—" He stopped abruptly, jaw clenching. Margaret's heart twisted. She reached out without thinking, her hand finding his arm and squeezing gently. "You could build one, for Sarah. I think she'd love that." Jacob looked down at her hand on his arm, then at her face. The moment stretched, heavy with things neither of them knew how to say. Then he nodded. "I'll start after lunch." He moved away, breaking the contact, and Margaret let her hand fall. But something had shifted again, another wall crumbling just slightly. Jacob was letting himself care about Sarah, letting himself imagine a future that included them. It was terrifying and hopeful in equal measure. By afternoon, Jacob had cleared space in the barn and laid out planks of wood, measuring and marking with careful precision. Sarah had come inside half-frozen and rosy-cheeked, and now sat near the fire watching Margaret prepare venison stew. The cabin felt warm and safe, insulated from the storm outside, and for a moment Margaret let herself believe this could last, that they could build something real here, something that went beyond mere survival. "Mama," Sarah's voice was small, uncertain. "Yes, sweet girl." "Is Mr. Jacob going to make us leave when winter's over?" The question drove the air from Margaret's lungs. She set down the knife she'd been using and knelt beside Sarah's chair. "Why would you think that?" Sarah's eyes were wide and worried. "Because that's what always happens. We find somewhere to stay and then we have to go. I don't want to go, Mama. I like it here. I like Mr. Jacob." Margaret pulled Sarah into her arms, blinking back sudden tears. "Oh, sweetheart, I don't think he wants us to leave. But even if we did have to go someday, we'd find somewhere good. I promise." But the promise felt hollow even as she spoke it, because the truth was Margaret didn't want to leave either. Somewhere between scrubbing floors and cooking meals and quiet evenings on the porch, this cabin had become home. Jacob had become what? Not family, not yet, but something important nonetheless. Someone who saw her, who valued her work, who defended her against small-town cruelty without expecting anything in return. That evening, after dinner, Jacob presented Sarah with a rough sketch of the sled he planned to build. Sarah studied it with solemn intensity, then looked up at him with shining eyes. "Will it really go fast?" "Fast as lightning," Jacob said, a hint of a smile playing at his lips. "But you have to promise to be careful, and your mother has to say it's all right." Both of them turned to Margaret expectantly. She looked at Jacob, at the hope in his expression, the tentative joy, and couldn't have said no if she'd wanted to. "It's all right. But Sarah, you have to listen when Mr. Jacob tells you something isn't safe." "I will," Sarah promised solemnly. She surprised them both by getting up and hugging Jacob quickly before retreating back to her mother's side, suddenly shy. Jacob froze, his arms half raised as if unsure what to do, and by the time he'd processed what happened, Sarah was already gone. Margaret saw the emotion wash over his face, surprise, pleasure, pain, all tangled together. He cleared his throat roughly and stood. "I'll work on it tonight. Should be ready in a few days." He retreated to the barn, needing space to process what had just happened. Margaret understood. Sarah's simple gesture had cracked something open in Jacob, let light into places that had been dark for a long time. That kind of vulnerability was dangerous, especially for a man who'd learned to protect himself with distance and silence. Later that night, Margaret ventured out to the barn with hot coffee. She found Jacob bent over his work, wood shavings curling at his feet, the lamplight casting long shadows. He looked up when she entered, surprise flickering across his face. "Thought you might be cold," she said, offering the cup. Jacob took it, their fingers brushing briefly. "Thank you." Margaret lingered, watching him work. The sled was already taking shape, the runners smooth and curved, the platform sturdy. "You're good at this, building things." "It's easier than dealing with people," Jacob said, a wry edge to his voice. "Wood doesn't talk back, doesn't leave." "No," Margaret agreed softly. "But it doesn't keep you warm at night either. Doesn't laugh or share meals or make a house feel like a home." Jacob's hand stilled on the wood. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Margaret felt exposed under that gaze. "Is that what this is to you? A home?" The question was loaded, dangerous. Margaret could deflect, could keep things safe and distant. Instead, she chose truth. "It's starting to feel like one, for me and Sarah both. I hope, maybe it could be one for you too, if you let it." Jacob set down his tools and stood, closing the distance between them until only a foot separated them. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. This close, she could see the flecks of gray in his beard, the lines carved around his eyes, the way his throat worked as he swallowed hard. "I want that," he said, voice rough and low. "More than I thought I could want anything again. But I'm scared, Margaret. Scared I'll fail you the way I failed Catherine. Scared you'll realize I'm not worth staying for." Margaret's hand moved of its own accord, reaching up to touch his face. Jacob flinched slightly, then leaned into the contact like a man starving for touch. "You didn't fail Catherine. You just wanted different things. And I'm not her. I don't need you to be something you're not. I just need you to be honest, to try." "I am trying," Jacob whispered. "Every day, it's just, I don't know how to do this, how to let people in without losing myself." "Then we'll figure it out together," Margaret said, echoing her words from that morning. "One day at a time, no promises beyond that." Jacob's hand came up to cover hers where it rested against his cheek. His palm was rough, calloused from years of hard work, but his touch was achingly gentle. "One day at a time," he repeated, like a prayer or a vow. They stood like that for a long moment, the barn quiet except for the soft sounds of the horses shifting in their stalls. Then Jacob stepped back, breaking the contact, and Margaret let him. Some things couldn't be rushed. Some walls had to come down slowly, brick by brick, or they'd crush you when they fell. "I should get back," Margaret said quietly. "Sarah will worry if I'm gone too long." Jacob nodded. "I'll be in soon, just want to finish the runners tonight." Margaret left him there with his work and his thoughts, but something had changed between them. Words had been spoken that couldn't be taken back, truths acknowledged that shifted the foundation of everything they were building. The next few days passed in a blur of snow and domesticity. Jacob finished the sled and spent an afternoon teaching Sarah how to ride it, running alongside her down the hill behind the cabin while Margaret watched from the porch, laughing at their antics. Sarah's delighted shrieks echoed off the trees, and when Jacob finally collapsed in the snow, breathing hard and grinning like a boy, something in Margaret's chest expanded so much it hurt. This was what family looked like. Not perfect, not traditional, but real and warm and alive. That night, as they sat around the table eating dinner, Sarah asked Jacob about his childhood. To Margaret's surprise, he answered, telling stories about growing up on a farm farther east, about his father teaching him to hunt and trap, about winters that seemed to last forever but never felt lonely because the house was always full of siblings and noise. His voice softened as he spoke, the harsh edges smoothing out, and Margaret saw the man he might have been if life hadn't carved him into something harder. "What happened to them?" Sarah asked. "Your family?" Jacob's expression shuddered slightly. "Fever took most of them, my parents, 3 of my siblings. I was 18. After that I just drifted, ended up here eventually." "That's sad," Sarah said solemnly, "but at least you have us now." The simple statement landed like a thunderclap. Jacob's throat worked, emotions warring across his face. Margaret held her breath, waiting to see if he'd retreat behind his walls or step forward into the truth of what Sarah had spoken. "Yeah," Jacob said finally, his voice thick. "At least I have you now." Sarah smiled and went back to her dinner as if she hadn't just rearranged the entire universe. But Margaret saw what it cost Jacob to accept that truth, to let himself be vulnerable enough to acknowledge that he needed them as much as they needed him. Later, after Sarah had gone to bed, Margaret and Jacob sat by the fire in comfortable silence. The wind had picked up outside, howling around the cabin's corners, but inside they were warm and safe. Jacob whittled while Margaret mended a torn shirt, their hands busy while their minds wandered. "I never thought I'd have this again," Jacob said suddenly, breaking the silence. "This feeling, like there's something worth waking up for beyond just survival." Margaret set down her mending and looked at him. "You deserve it, Jacob. You deserve to be happy." "So do you," he replied, meeting her eyes. "After everything you've been through, everything you've survived, you deserve more than just safety." "What more is there?" Margaret asked softly. Jacob held her gaze, something intense burning in his eyes. "Joy, laughter, someone who sees you and doesn't look away." He paused, then added in a whisper, "Love, if you're brave enough to reach for it." Margaret's breath caught. They were standing on the edge of something vast and terrifying, and she knew that what they said next would determine everything. She could step back, keep things safe and simple, or she could step forward into the unknown. "Are you," she asked, "brave enough?" Jacob set down his whittling and stood, crossing to where she sat. He knelt beside her chair so they were eye level, his expression open in a way she'd never seen. "I want to be, for you, for Sarah, for the life we could build together if we're willing to try." Margaret's hand found his, fingers intertwining. "Then let's be brave together." Jacob smiled then, a real, full smile that transformed his entire face, and Margaret felt something inside her shift and settle, like pieces of a puzzle finally finding their place. They stayed like that, hands clasped and eyes locked, while the fire crackled and the wind sang and the snow continued to fall, burying the past and making way for something new.